Let's get the latest from my NBC News colleagues who are covering both parts of this story. NBC News White House correspondent Kristen Welker is on the North Lawn for us, and Mike Memoli is covering the Biden campaign in New Hampshire. So, Kristen, where does this fight go from here?
That's the big question, Katie. What we have right now is an escalating standoff. The White House, as you say, releasing that letter to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi last night, essentially saying you need to hold a vote to officially open up an impeachment inquiry. Now, what does the Constitution say? The Constitution says the House of Representatives shall have the sole power of impeachment. So Nancy Pelosi says bottom line is that's case closed. As you pointed out, she indicated that this type of action would be considered obstruction and could be impeachable in and of itself. I've been talking to senior administration officials who say, look, they want to force a vote because they essentially want there to be terms by which they need to adhere to this process. Now, President Trump was asked what would happen if they did, in fact, hold a vote. Would he, in fact, cooperate with demands by House Democrats? The president didn't close the door on it, but said only if it's fair. So sort of left himself some wiggle room in case they do decide to hold a vote to determine that ultimately he's not comfortable with the terms. But, Katie, the question is, what is this going to do to the timing? Is this going to essentially slow the process down? Remember, House Democrats wanted to have a vote by the new year on an actual impeachment. Big question now about whether or not that's going to happen. Or could this speed things up? Could they determine to bring articles of impeachment based on obstruction of justice? We just don't know at this point.
Kristen Welker, the president has a really fragile ego. It's been reported that he doesn't really want to be impeached, doesn't like the idea of that asterisk being put on his name through history. So is he ready for that? Is he ready to force a vote on impeachment? Does he really want to be the third president in the United States to be impeached?
I think you highlight the internal divide here at the White House and even within the president's own mind. Politically speaking, there are some administration officials who think that this could help him with his reelection bid, could energize his base. But you're absolutely right. This is a president who doesn't want to be associated with that asterisk. He doesn't want to become one of the presidents who's impeached. Now, what they are calling for is a vote to open up officially the impeachment inquiry. But House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is saying, hey, look at the Constitution. It doesn't say we have to hold a vote to do that. If you do look back at history, though, Katie, the past three impeachment processes have started with a vote. So that is the argument that the White House is making. It's really a procedural argument, though. And that's where you have these battle lines being drawn. But I think you make a really important point, Katie, which is that if you talk to allies of the president, they say the bottom line is he's watching these polls go up, the support for impeaching him and even for an impeachment inquiry rising. And that's disconcerting to this president. And he's concerned, frankly, about what that might do to his political prospects, despite the fact that a lot of people think it's going to energize his base. Katie.
He might have a lock on the Republican Party. But, Kristen, as you full well know, and our viewers know after watching this network for many years now, the president won by a very small margin. He doesn't have that much room for error. Just even losing a handful of people could be devastating for him in 2020. Mike Memoli, Vice President Biden came out for the first time today and said the president should be impeached. Talk to me about what was happening behind the scenes and whether they think the president should be removed from office if it ever came to that.
Well, it's so interesting, Katie, because for the last few weeks, obviously, Joe Biden got in this race arguing that he was the Democrat best capable of taking on Donald Trump. And so a lot of Democrats have been wondering, really, frankly, where has Joe Biden been these last few weeks as the president, as his allies are just relentless in attacking him, raising questions about Hunter Biden and his business dealings and how it may have affected the vice president during his time in office. The answer from the Biden campaign has been, well, first of all, he's been out on the West Coast mainly raising money. He's had a few public events, but really that this is not a candidate who, as you know, Republicans long grappled with the question of how you take on Donald Trump. Biden has always said he's not necessarily somebody who I want to get in the mud with and be wrestling with on a daily basis. And they did see this, though, as a moment to sort of step out and for Biden to address this issue on his terms. And Biden advisors are saying that there's a lot that has changed significantly just in the past 2 weeks. We've had the transcript of that conversation between President Trump and the Ukrainian president. We've had the whistleblower complaint now come out. You saw the president on the South Lawn of the White House calling on China to investigate Biden. And then, of course, just yesterday, the White House telling Capitol Hill, we're not going to cooperate in any way, shape, or form. And so that gave Biden the opportunity today, yes, to cross that Rubicon, to call for impeachment, but also give a speech that was about much more than that, a moment of really national emergency, as he even put it. He said, we can't have a president who would abuse all the tools of his office just to get reelected. He called the president's conduct un-American. This is a candidate who they always think is at his strongest when it's a question of national urgency, and that's what he sought to accomplish today.
Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Beat the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.